Go ahead, Sally.
Hi, everybody.
Good evening. Good evening. Here we are.
Who are we, Sally?
Okay. All right. Good evening. Welcome to the Contra Costa Tail Spinners. Yay! Yay! So, haven't we had some glorious weather? Yes, we certainly have. It's been glorious, and it ushers in a glorious evening of storytelling. I'm so happy to have all of you here. I've been doing a little storytelling myself in class, and it just has renewed my energy and my enthusiasm for stories. And I can't wait to hear all of you, our feature teller and all the other people that are going to join us tonight. And so I think it's almost 5 after. I think, Liz, now I will turn it back to you so that you can introduce our tellers and get on with the program.
Thank you, Sally. We have a wonderful evening of stories for you tonight with storytellers from near and far. And that's the beauty or the silver lining of this Zoom world that we're in. So we're going to kick off our storytelling tonight with a poem and a story from Diamond. And Diamond will be coming to us. This is giving us a chance to really appreciate the oral tradition.
Okay, now I'm going to do a short
Screen share situation. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Diamond. Oh, now that beautiful line. There was one line I particularly loved. But it went out of my head with that image. All right. Now I get to introduce our featured storyteller for the night. And her name is Renu Narayan, and she is coming to us all the way from South India, from the city of Chennai. And we are so thrilled that she has found us across the ocean and has come quite regularly to our swap since we've been on Zoom. She is part of an amazing community of storytellers in India, especially around the city of Chennai. And they're all special in their own way, but Renu is just such a special soul, and she is all about love, compassion, kindness, and respect. She's using storytelling to spread that to children, to adults, again, locally and across the world. She curates a bi-monthly storytelling festival, which she calls Kata Popuri. And she kindly invited me to be one of her tellers, and she's looking around, and that was a wonderful experience. You know, looking around, not just to tell stories and hear stories, but to really connect us all on a person-to-person, heart-to-heart level. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Renu to share a little bit more of her stories with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's an honor actually to be a featured teller at this walk. I hope my screen is reasonably clear. So thank you very much once again. A very good evening to all of you. And I'm very happy to share a story I've written myself. It's called The House on the Hill. And I truly, really hope you like and enjoy it. So here it goes. It was around 4 p.m. The old bus had left the plains far behind and had started to climb up the steep mountain, one hairpin bend after the other. There were only a handful of passengers on the bus, and most of them were dozing. The bus continued to move up and up with a constant crashing of gears and honking. And finally, it had completed the last hairpin bend. And as the road straightened out, a bus stop came in view. It started to slow and then shuddered to a halt. The passengers were awake. Krishna, whose head had fallen forward, that sudden jerk, woke up with a start. He looked out and realized that it was his stop. Bone weary, he picked up his backpack, put it on, and quickly alighted from the bus. He stood there for a moment, watching as the bus trundled away, and with the final honk, it disappeared round a bend. And now he was all alone, no one and nothing in sight. He looked around. The woman at the employment agency had told him that he would find a signboard that would take him to the house. He found it almost instantly. There it was, a small black board. On it was written Rose Cottage. The path was a narrow, steep one. It had been cut through the tea plantation and seemed to be going up. Feeling that intense cold, he wrapped his arms around himself and started off at a brisk pace. But the path was steeper than he had expected. Panting for breath and cursing under his breath, he continued, "Am I lost? Am I ever going to find that God-forsaken house?" he thought to himself. But as he rounded a bend, there it was. The gates, they stood wide open, as though welcoming him to walk through. That long walk had warmed him, but now again he started to shiver. And so quickly walking through the gates, he started moving towards that light, that small light that beckoned him forward. As he neared, he realized that it was clearly not a cottage. It was a colonial bungalow, that beautiful sloped tiled roof, French windows, and a strong wooden door. Completely exhausted, he pushed that bell. He heard it jangling deep within the house, and he waited impatiently, tired, bone weary. He heard shuffling footsteps coming closer, and slowly the door swung open. Through the dimly lit interior, he could make out the silhouette of an old woman leaning on a cane. "Yes," she said. "Miss Rao, I have been sent by the employment agency. You are expecting an assistant?" "Ah, yes. You are the assistant. Come in, but shut the door behind you first." And she started to walk away. Krishna quickly shut the door and followed in her wake. He could vaguely make out that there were doors on either side of the corridor. She turned into the third door, and what a stark contrast it was. A warm, cozy room. A wood fire was burning in the fireplace. It was so comfortably furnished in upholstered sofas, faded cotton fabric. She leant her cane against one of them and lowered herself down. Gesturing to the one opposite, she said, "Please sit." He sat down and waited. She was scrutinizing him pretty closely, and he felt a little uncomfortable. It was as though her piercing glance went right through to his very soul. I was expecting someone older. You look way too young." How old are you and what is your name?" she asked. "I'm Krishna and I'm 30, he said, feeling nervous. What would a young man like you, why would you want to maroon yourself up in the hills, being an assistant to an old woman like me? It's going to be a lonely life, you know. Are you hiding a secret? Are you running away from something? You must be in some kind of an unfortunate situation, I'm sure." "Yes, to be very honest, I am in a kind of a desperate situation. You see, I'm an alcoholic. I've not had a drop of liquor for the last 2 months. Not because I wanted to stop, but because I had run out of money. And believe me, I don't come from an unfortunate background. My parents are wonderful people. They had me when they were quite old, and they gave me all the love and everything that I wanted. I have only been a disgrace to them. I was brilliant at my studies. I got a wonderful job at the age of 22. But the money and the success went right to my head. And I started to party and became a slave to alcohol. I lost one job after the other, lost everything. My worldly possessions are there in this backpack. Yesterday was the last straw when my landlord threw me out and I had nowhere to go. My parents would take me back, but I didn't want to go to them like this. I had two options: kill myself or to take to a life of crime. And neither was appealing. I was desperate to redeem myself, but I had no idea how. And then the call came from the employment agency, and I jumped at it. And that's why I'm here. I see. Oh, I'm so sorry, Krishna. I should have offered you some refreshments. I've just been interrogating you. 1 minute, please. And she pressed the bell next to her on the wall. A few minutes later, an elderly man walked in. Yes, Indu. Anything? Yes, Murthy. Could you please get some coffee and something to eat for this young man, Krishna, here? Of course, of course. He smiled at both of them and disappeared. A few seconds later, he was back with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of snacks. Just the coffee, please, not the snacks. Thank you, said Krishna, accepting the mug gratefully. He sipped at the aromatic hot beverage and immediately felt better. She waited until he had finished. And then she said, well, Krishna, I'm no one to judge you on your past. I listened to your story. Now you listen to mine. When I said I want an assistant, I really meant someone who's middle-aged, and I need someone more of a companion than an assistant. There will be a little bit of typing work to do, of course, but it's not much. So much of your work will be to do with some odd jobs around the house. You've seen Murthy? He's very old, just a few years younger to me. He joined my father as his assistant, but he refuses to retire. He refuses to leave because I'm all alone in this house. And he's been doing everything for me. And I feel terribly guilty. I want him to go back and live with his family in the town. And that's why I was looking for an assistant. And if you take up this job, he will go back home. And one more thing, I am an insomniac. Sometimes I'm up at 2 and 3 in the morning, and I crave for a hot cup of coffee. And it'll be your duty to bring it to me. And if you're okay with all of this, you can decide whether you want to stay. In fact, if you look at it, I think I'm in a more desperate situation than you are. And she smiled, and her face transformed. And he was so touched by that transformation. He said, I'll stay. And that was that. Krishna was shown to his room. He got into bed, covered himself, and fell asleep. And then he heard a bell. He had no idea what time that was. But he was so comfortable. He pulled the cover closer over his head and continued to sleep. The next morning, he went down to the kitchen looking for coffee. The kitchen was flooded with sunlight. The rear door stood wide open. And just then someone came in, bringing in more warmth, a bubbly, plump woman with a big smile on her face. You must be Krishna. Indu Akka told me about you. What would you like? Some coffee, idlis, sambar, chutney? Everything is fresh. Just half a cup of black coffee, please. Just coffee? No wonder you're so skinny, all skin and bones. I tell you, I'm a very good cook. And if you refuse to eat my food, you'll regret it. Just the coffee, please, repeated Krishna. Okay, she gave him the coffee, freshly brewed, fragrant. He enjoyed every sip. Look, Krishna, there's everything right here. If you ever need coffee for yourself or for Indu Akka, you'll find everything here. I come in here only to make breakfast and lunch. After that, the kitchen is yours. He went back to that room. And sure enough, she was sitting there in her chair. She looked up at him and she said, so Krishna, did you Rest well last night? Yes, I did, Indu said. Well, did you hear the bell? I did, but I was too tired to get up. Krishna, I'm afraid getting up at that time in the morning is not easy, but it's part of your job. And I'm afraid if you can't do it, then Krishna, then Murthy will not leave and you'll have to leave. Her voice was stern, but there was an appeal in her eyes. Krishna felt ashamed. He said, it won't happen again, Indu. And from that night on, Krishna did wake up, he made a cup of coffee, and he hated it. Because when he went back to bed, the bed was cold and he couldn't sleep for a long time. And he hated it. He hated her. He hated the situation. He wanted to throttle her sometimes. But as the days and the nights went by, he got used to it. The early morning encounters, the conversations, anecdotes she shared with him. Sometimes he just laughed out loud. And the books she asked him to read to her. He actually enjoyed reading those books along with her. And so slowly, the bond started growing between the two. During the day, there were minor things he had to do, a little bit of typing. Sometimes he helped her to go and sit out in the garden. And one evening she said, Krishna, I think you should start going for a walk in the evenings. Indu, I'm not that kind at all. I tell you, you will miss out. This hill is private property. There are some spectacular views around. You must go for a walk. The first time he went out, he felt a bit resentful that she was forcing him. The second day and the third day, he started actually enjoying it. And as the days passed, he went for longer and longer walks. One day he reached right on top of the hill, and just as she had said, the views were absolutely magnificent. The tall mountains, the beautiful trees, the colorful flowers, the birds. Sometimes he saw deer, sometimes he saw such exotic butterflies. And one night, he just spent the whole night out. The cold no longer bothered him. He lay down and watched the full moon, the stars, and his heart filled with gratitude. One morning, when he looked at himself in the mirror, he couldn't recognize the stranger. Sparkling eyes, glowing face, healthy hair. He had put on so much of weight. Vasanti had noticed, and she had been plying him with one delicious dish after the other. One evening, as he was setting out on his walk, he peeped in to see Indu sitting in her chair. She beckoned him in, and he walked in a little surprised. She normally just said bye and sent him off. But today she said, sit down, Krishna, sit down. I felt like having a chat with you. And so he sat down. And she said, so Krishna, tell me, are you happy here? Indu, what kind of a question is that? Of course I'm happy. I love being here. I love this house. I love being with you. I love the hills. I'm so happy and grateful. Krishna, I'm very grateful to you too. Have you noticed? Sometimes the bell doesn't ring. That's because I'm sleeping through the night. You have helped me more than you think, Krishna. Thank you, Indu. No, thank you, Krishna. I always thought why God is keeping me alive. I always thought, what is there? What is the purpose of keeping me? And now I think I know. You may go now. And so Krishna left. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked so much that by the time he turned around and came back home, it was close to midnight. And when he entered the house, he was very surprised to see the light was still on in that room. She normally went to bed if he came maybe after 10. So seeing the light, he knocked on the door and walked in. And she was there. Her head had fallen forward and she seemed to be fast asleep. He wondered whether he should disturb her and take her back to her room or just leave her there. And something made him feel a bit afraid. So he went closer. He took her hand. It was still warm because the fire had just died out. When he felt for a pulse, there was none. So he took her hand, placed his cheek on it, and then he wept with deep, racking sobs. He cried and cried and cried like he had never cried before. Thank you.
Ah. Thank you, Renu. That was so beautiful. Story of redemption. What a good one. Story of humanity that we need to hear these days more than ever, and connection and all the things we long for and we need. So thank you so much.
I hope I didn't go over time, Liz. That
Yeah,
was
you-
my biggest concern.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're off to such a marvelous start, and we have lots more great stories to come. Our next storyteller is Claire Castell, and she has a story for us called Luck.
Hi, everybody. Renew, that was really beautiful, really enjoy. It's so hard to follow somebody like you. It was just great. So the story I am going to tell was created from a story prompt, as many of you know. And the story prompt was find a picture and tell a story about it. So I want to show you this picture first before I start the story because it will be relevant. So I'm going to do a little screen share. Oops, see this one here. Can you all see this picture? This is a picture of the woman in the middle is my mother. This fellow over here is Uncle John. This is Uncle Bob. This is Uncle Bill. And I don't know if you can see the guy on the far right is Uncle Paul. And Uncle Paul will be in this story. Let me close this up, but this is a great picture, isn't it? It's in the 40s. Look at those wide lapels, just amazing. And my mother looks so debonair with that hat. That was anyway. You know, I have never been the person that wins the door prize. I don't win the lotto, and Publishers Clearinghouse has never come to my door, but I do have a really good life. You know, and it seems to me good luck is what you call it when you get what you desire. Bad luck is the undesired outcome. You know, you play the lotto and you win $500 and it's good luck. And if you don't win anything, it's bad luck. But it isn't quite as simple as that. You know, getting pregnant while my marriage was disintegrating was not a desired outcome. Beating the 99.9% effectiveness of my birth control was not really what I had wanted. But as it turns out, having that baby boy was the best thing I ever did. He was my Publishers Clearinghouse, he was the lotto, and he was the door prize of my life. You know, and also, you know, divorcing my husband wasn't really what I'd hoped for. It wasn't the desired outcome. I was waiting for the happily ever after. But, you know, countless times, since my divorce, I've thought, boy, if I was still married, I couldn't have this much fun. I wouldn't have been able to go Contra dancing at the women's gym at Stanford or dance the Argentine tango in Buenos Aires. I wouldn't be able to travel to Tahiti or England or Italy or Germany, all those places, because my husband didn't like to travel. So nowadays I see my divorce as good luck. It was not a bad outcome. Now, when my parents died when we were children, and I'm talking about my twin sister, Carol, and I'm not going to put a happy face on that, but we knew we had 4 uncles, as you saw in the picture, my mother's brother. And so it seemed really likely that we would go live with one of them. But none of the uncles came forward to take us, and we ended up with unrelated foster parents. And I found that pretty confusing as a child and a little bit hurtful. I knew that Uncle Paul was really well off. And we really never heard much from the uncles most of our childhood. But when we were in our 30s in the 80s, we found Uncle Paul Kirk in the phone book. Remember those? And we arranged to meet him at his place in Los Altos. At that time, I had been raising my son. I'd put myself through college. I bought a house. I was building a good career in Silicon Valley. And at this visit, I found out that Uncle Paul had put almost all his kids through Ivy League colleges. And I was kind of pissed. Man, if he'd adopted us, I could have gone to Stanford. Now, he was kind of pompous and self-absorbed, but still, I'd had to work my ass off to get what I had at that point. And it would have been easy street at that point if he took us in. Well, after my retirement, a couple of 3 years ago, I started doing ancestry.com, as a lot of us do. And a couple of cousins from one of the other uncles, the one on the far left, found us. And then the whole cousin thing snowballed, and soon we were talking to a number of Uncle Paul. Uncle Paul had 9 kids. And this was really exciting, but it was in the middle of COVID and we, couldn't meet right away. However, one of the Uncle Paul cousins, Brian, decided to visit anyway. Now, my sister and I sat on my big deck outside, 6 feet apart, and drank some wine with him. But I tell you, he misogynistically declared every woman in his life mentally ill, including my mother, who he didn't even know. And he was alcoholic. He just kept drinking and drinking. Ugh. He made a pass at my sister, Carol, too. I mean, we're first cousins. What a putz. Well, last October, this past October, we did organize a Kirk family. I call it the Cousin Palooza. And the 2 cousins from the South came out to California and met up with me. And then we met with some of Uncle Paul's daughters. We had lunch together. And as we went around the room, each woman talked about her life with Uncle Paul. It seems like the women, the daughters in the family, took a special brand of his abuse. Kathy, she was fragile, quiet. Liz was outgoing, but she talked about how Uncle Paul would just rage at very small things. And Alice said he never thought they were smart enough for anything and berated them all the time. And she had been in therapy for years. Every one of those cousins, Uncle Paul's kids, talked about how awful he'd been. Whew. Well, my twin sister, Carol, hadn't been able to go to lunch that day. She was working. So I called her that night. I said, hey, Carol, even though our parents died when we were little, I think we might be the sanest of the cousins in the bunch. I think we dodged a bullet by not going with Uncle Paul. When you don't get what you want, sometimes your bad luck is really your good luck. You just don't know it yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And thanks for sharing that picture. We got a picture worth 1,000 words and a story together. Awesome. Well, our next, we have a storyteller who wasn't able to be with us tonight, so I think I will slip in a story. And Claire's story reminded me of one Chinese story that I know called Good Luck, Bad Luck, which some of you may know, but that's not what I'm going to tell. I'm going to tell a story, a riddle story. I've been visiting some elementary and middle school students over the last couple of years on Zoom and in person. And And I always like to tell them a story where there's something in it that they have to figure out. How did somebody solve a case or something like that? So this one is from China, and it's about a boy, a poor boy who lived with his mother in a village, and his mother baked the best pastries in the village. They were crispy and flaky and, greasy in that good way. And they were too poor to have a store. So she would bake them and he would put them in a basket and take them around the village and sell them. And around this time of year with Lunar New Year and the Lantern Festival, they were very popular. And it was, one day he had sold a lot and collected a lot of money, and he was so tired. He was just a little boy. He saw a big stone on the side of the road, and he thought, I'll just sit down and rest. Well, wouldn't you know it, he fell asleep. And when he woke up and he looked in the basket, not only were there no pastries, there was no money. Someone had stolen all of it. And he burst into tears, as you can imagine. And just then, the magistrate of the village, the local official who acted as the judge and who was known far and wide for his wisdom, but also for his eccentricity, was walking by. He saw the little boy crying and asked why. The boy explained. The judge looked at the boy and looked at the stone he was lying, sitting up against. And he said, well, there's no one else here. It's this stone must have stolen your money. And so I'm going to have this stone arrested and put on trial. And that's what he did. He had his bailiffs come and they tied the stone up and they put it in a cart. They brought it to the courtyard in front of the magistrates. And the next day he put that stone on trial. Now, you can imagine that when the villagers heard that this was happening, they all came to watch. They watched as the judge said to the stone, now, where were you when this boy's coins and pastries were stolen? The stone didn't say anything. Do you have an alibi? Why did you steal this? Every question. Do you have anybody who can speak for you? Your good character. Well, the stone never answered a single question. And the judge said, well, you obviously have nothing to say for yourself. You are guilty. And I decree the punishment will be 30 lashes. And he got his assistants to come and get the lashes, and they started lashing and beating the stone. Well, at this point, all the villagers who were standing around, they just couldn't help themselves. They started to laugh at this absurdity. And the judge, what impertinence, what disrespect. I am the authority. For this, you will all pay a fine. And he named the small, not a large amount, but a few coins. And he ordered that everyone there line up in a line, and they were going to have to pay their fine in a very special way. He got a jar brought out, and he had his assistants fill the jar with water. And then one by one, the people came and dropped their coins in, and he watched carefully. And after they had all done that, he looked around at the crowd and he turned to one of the people and said, you are the thief. It is you who stole this boy's money. You stole his pastries. And what do you have to say for yourself? Well, the thief, for indeed it was he was the thief. His face went pale. He bowed down. He apologized. I'm sorry. It's true. It was me. And everyone was amazed and happy, that the judge had somehow found this out, but none of them could understand. How did he figure out that that was the thief? They couldn't figure it out, but can you? So if you can, you could put an idea in the chat. And when I do this with students, I always say, I don't care if you get the answer right. I just want to hear how you think. And I want us to like listen to each other's ideas and see if we can come up with it. So I'm going to look at the chat. Vicky says, Marnie says sticky fingers. That's, you're on the right track. Who could add to that? Sticky fingers. Sri Karuna, she's got it. The coins when dropped had an oily residue coming up. Why? Why that man's? Because he had stolen all those flaky, greasy, delicious pastries. So when he reached in his pocket to pay the coins, the drops of oil floated on the top of the water. So that's the story of the guilty stone.
Very
So these are really fun kind of stories to tell. So there's so many different kind of stories to tell, so many places to tell stories. We're going to take our break in a minute and come back, and Colleen will be our next teller after the break. But first we'll have a couple of announcements. And one announcement I want to make, I want to thank Sarah Armstrong, who is the chair of the board of the Storytelling Association of California. You may have seen that she put in the chat. I'm going to try and find it. To remind us all, we've had a conversation within the swaps and with the SAC, that to make sure that we all understand that the stories that you hear and see tonight, the storytellers who told those stories, they have the rights to their story. They hold copyright for these stories. If you want to tell one of the stories that you hear tonight, please contact the teller directly to ask their permission. So if you ever need help contacting them, you can, get in touch with the swap host, which you're here because you have a connection with one of us. So that's one announcement. Sarah has another really important announcement.
Yay, Bay Area Storytelling Festival is back. April 16th at the Orinda Community Center, where we were last we saw you, on that Saturday from 9 to 6. I'll put in the URL. You can get tickets. You can see the schedule. It's going to be way cool. We have Sheila Arnold from Virginia who will be here, Diane Ferlat, Ethnotech, Willie Claflin, and Corey Rosen. It's going to be quite a day. Hope you can all come. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's going to be right where, in the same place as Contra Costa Tail Spinners used to meet, basically in that same building complex. So some of you know how to get there already. I think Marion Ferranti, are you here from Delta Word Weavers, one of our,
I'm here.
okay.
Welcome back to Storytellers.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're back. Contra Costa Tail Spinners is back, and we welcome for the next story, which will be a traditional story, Colleen Foley, one of our regulars.
Yes. So hi, everyone. My name is Colleen, and my story tonight is the legend of Rip Van Winkle. And it is, it's a tale from New York. And I want to go there someday, but I haven't been. But it's a tale, it was written by Washington Irving, or maybe collected by Washington Irving. You can decide at the end of the story. And he published it in 1819. So it was quite a while ago, over 100 years ago, or 200 years ago. And it's a story it was, in the time of the story, it was under English rule as a colony. So, but the characters in the story are, it's a little village outside of New York, and they're all descended from the Dutch settlers, because remember, it was New Amsterdam before it was New York. So these are people that were descendants from the first settlers from Europe of New Amsterdam. and they live in this little village. And there was a man, and his name was Rip Van Winkle, and he was married and had 2 children, a boy and a girl. But you know, sometimes when people get married, you know, if they marry opposites, some marriages, they work it out and they become perfectly, you know, help each other and perfectly in tune with each other. But unfortunately, Rip Van Winkle and his wife, she was really neat and wanted everything, and she was ambitious, and he wasn't. He liked to watch the sunset. And so as the marriage went on, she became a nag and he became very lazy. So, and they couldn't, you know, they didn't have divorce back then. So they were sort of stuck with each other. And so he felt that he was really picked on. So oftentimes during the day, he would go and you know, in small towns, there used to be a place where all the gentlemen would sit and talk all day. So, you know, they would come and go, and that was by the inn. And so Whip Van Winkle spent most of his time there talking to his old cronies. And he also had a little dog that followed him everywhere he went, and his dog was named Wolf. And he wasn't that little, a medium-sized dog. And so they went around. And so one day, his wife wanted him to do something, and she was so mad. She went up to the inn where he was talking to his pals and yelled at him and reprimanded him right in front of all his friends. And he felt so terrible that he, and she may have had very good reason, because he didn't do stuff around the house. He helped other farmers, and he told stories to children, and he made toys for children, but he never worked on his own farm. So she might have been right, but it wasn't working out. So he felt so bad. He went home, and then he got his rifle, because back in those days, it was the frontier. Oftentimes you could go out and bring home something for dinner. So he got his flintlock, and he took his dog Wolf, and they went out and they climbed up. This is on, the village was on the Hudson River, close to the Catskill Mountains. So they climbed up a ridge in the Catskill Mountains, and he looked at and he forgot he was hunting for food. And so he looked at the view and admired the view, looked at the river, looked at the mountains, looked at the other farmers' fields, and just thought it was so beautiful. Then it was getting late and he had to go home, and he says, "Oh, I don't want to go home." But he did anyway. So he went down, and then while he was on the way down the mountain, he heard someone say, "Van Winkle, Van Winkle, over here, Van Winkle." And so he looked, and there was a little man dressed in really, really old-fashioned clothes, and he had a big barrel on his back. And Van Winkle said, "Well, I have to get home." And he says, "Oh," the little man said, "Please help, please help." So he went over to the little man. I was like, because he liked to do things for other people, just not his wife. And so he went and he took the barrel from the little man and carried it. And the little man led away down a gully into a dell with sort of rocks around it. And in there was a lot of other little people with old-fashioned clothes on, and they were playing 9 pins, which is an ancestor of bowling. And the thunder was going, and so he put the barrel down, and the guys opened up the barrel, and it was full of hard liquor, the kind that the old Dutch and Vikings used to drink. So they handed him a cup of that. So he drank the cup, and he fell asleep immediately. And he woke up, and he was back where he'd started. And Wolf wasn't around. He whistled for Wolf. He whistled for Wolf, and Wolf wouldn't come. And then he looked around, and he couldn't find the path. He says, "Maybe those guys have my dog." And so he couldn't find the path of where he'd gone the night before. And then he looked at his gun, and his gun was all rusty. His flintlock was rusty, and it couldn't work anymore. The powder was all wet and dried up and expired. And so he said, "Well, I'll go back to town and see what's going on. Maybe those guys left, you know, they robbed me of my dog and my gun." And so he went back to town, and on the way to town, he met people. He passed people, he nodded, but they didn't recognize him, and he didn't recognize them. He thought he knew everybody in town. And so he went back to his house, and his house was dirty and not like his wife, who kept everything really neat. The roof was caved in, it was empty. He went inside, called for his children and his wife, and no one came. And he went to the inn, and on the inn, there used to be a picture of George III on the wall by the door, in the wall by the door. So he went to the inn, and the building of the inn had been torn down. This is where he sat with his friends. The building had been torn down, and there was a new building up. And on the wall by the door, there was a picture of a guy whose name was George Washington, believe it or not. Who was he? And so he started, and so he started, since he, and then he touched his chin, and he realized, oh my goodness, I have a beard down to my waist. Where did that come from? He didn't know. And so he started asking. So there were still some guys sitting by the inn, and he says, where is my friend George blankety blank? And he says, oh, he died of old age a couple years ago. And he says, really? And he says, well, where is my friend David? He says, oh, he was killed in the war. What war? The war for independence. Oh my goodness. Where is my friend Fred? Well, you know, he was in the soldier in the war, and now he's serving as a representative in Congress. In Congress, but we're subjects of the king. And they said, what are you, a Tory? Oh. Says, you are a Tory, aren't you? And he says, well, no. He tried to save the subject now. Now, what happened to Rip Van Winkle? And he says, oh, he disappeared 20 years ago when he went out hunting with his dog and never came back. And he says, but I'm Rip Van Winkle. And they said, sure. And so he says, and they said, that's his son, Rip. And he looked like a younger version of him, looked like he did look 20 years ago. And he thought, oh no. But then a little kid ran down the street to a farmhouse, a little out of town, and brought back a young woman with a baby. And he said, who are you? And who's that baby? And she says, I am Rip Van Winkle, was my father, and this is his grandson, Rip. And he says, I'm Rip Van Winkle. And she says, my father disappeared 20 years ago when he out hunting and never came back. And so an older lady went up to him that had known him, that was a neighbor. And she says, she looked at him really close in the eye, and she says, you are Rip Van Winkle, aren't you? And so he told his story of the little people with the old fashioned clothes, and his daughter, you know, ended up adopting, you know, he spent the rest of his life living with his daughter, and he did everything he wanted to do. He told stories to the children. He made toys for the children, and he talked a lot to the guys by the inn on the bench. And that was the story. Some people believed his story and some people didn't. Some people thought, but he was nice to everyone, so he was a likable fellow. Some people thought he had just hid from his wife, who had died that year of a stroke, earlier that year of a stroke. And so he came back when she was gone, or had this story really happened to him? Well, some people did some research later on, and the native people that lived in the valley knew that there was a spirit that lived in that dell that would sometimes come down and mess with people's lives. So maybe she was just using European symmetry for this one man. Who knows? Was it real or wasn't it real? Did Washington Irving make it up and write the story, or did he hear it from the townspeople, from something that really happened? We don't know, but it's a good story. Thank you.
Colleen, that was a good story. An oldie but a goodie brought back to life because
Yes.
you shared it. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Our next storyteller is Cynthia Cuddeback, and she has a story called The Ship's Not Taken, and I am very intrigued. The Ship's Not Taken. Tell us about it.
Well, this last fall, I was having a romantic dinner in Newport, Oregon, in this nice restaurant overlooking the river. You could actually hear the sea lions barking. But what was really interesting to me was across the river, there was a long pier, and tied to the pier were two ships, both of which were quite familiar. In fact, if I had sailed on either of those ships. I was supposed to sail on both of those ships. But if I had sailed on either of those ships, I would not have been where I was that evening. You see, the story starts 35 years ago, fresh out of college with a physics degree, and I joined the NOAA Corps of Commissioned Officers. My job was to operate research vessels. So you should imagine me in a natty little Navy uniform with a crisp white cap, standing on the bridge of a rather large ship saying, "Right full rudder, all ahead half, steady as she goes." Actually, if you walk through that, you may have realized I just had the ship going in circles. I wasn't very good at vessel operations. But as I mentioned, I did have a physics degree, which meant that, and I'd also let the people in the NOAA Corps know that I was very interested in oceanographic research. I was originally assigned to a ship called the Rainier, sailing out of Seattle. The Rainier was that ship on the left when I was in Newport. But when I was in officer training, I received a letter. "Dear Ensign Cutterback, given your strong interest in oceanographic research, instead of stationing you at the Rainier in Seattle, we are going to shift you to the NOAA ship researcher sailing out of Miami." Whoa, okay, going across the country, whole different world. You know, like a week later in officer training, we saw this video made by the guys on the Rainier, and the ship was covered with ice, and they were whacking it with baseball bats. And so maybe I didn't really regret switching to this larger ship that was going to do climate studies out of, yes, Miami, Florida. We sailed around the Caribbean. We went through the Panama Canal. We made port calls in Tahiti. We made port calls in Hawaii. We did not make a port call in Peru because Shining Path was down there causing trouble, but the entire ship took a big starboard list as we passed the Lima Harbor because we couldn't go into Peru. But it was a lovely time. Sometime let me tell you about the equator crossing, a different story. Learned a lot about how oceanographic research is conducted in the deep ocean. And this may be part of the reason that the next letter I received said, "Dear Lieutenant Grade Cutterback," I've been promoted. "Dear Lieutenant Grade Cutterback, given your strong background in physics and science, we are next sending you to Seattle, where you will conduct pollution studies as your shore assignment." Yes, I get to move to Seattle. I get to move to Seattle. All right. So I went to Seattle. I did a lot of studies, work on pollution in Puget Sound. I went from this big blue water study to this much more compact region, and published a paper. I even took some classes at the University of Washington. And then I got another letter. "Lieutenant J. G. Cutterback, given that you are much better at doing science than you are at operating research vessels, we will not be promoting you to full lieutenant." Okay, I always knew I was going to go to graduate school. In fact, I have already started taking classes at the University of Washington. And the University of Washington has its own ship, the Thomas G. Thompson. The Thomas G. Thompson was the ship that was tied up in front of the Rainier in Newport at the beginning of this story. And I said, okay, I've done climate work at sea. I'm going to do more climate work. They're going to love me. I've got my background in ship handling, and I've taken classes, and it's going to be fine. Dear Ms. Cutterback, thank you, but no, thank you. P.S. Someone in geophysics wants to talk to you. Okay, not sailing on the Thompson. Going to meet with a new guy. I have a research advisor. Instead of sailing across the blue ocean on 300-foot vessel, I am going to go out on the Columbia River Bar, the most rugged and violent water in the Northwest, on a ship that's only 165 feet long. I am going to get a doctorate in barfing on the bar. Ha! Well, so now here I was in the geophysics program instead of the oceanography program where I intended to be. And I started taking classes with other people with interests in the earth. And there was this guy sitting next row over, really great legs, really cute, really smart. So one day after class, I just sort of asked, the room at large, anybody care to have lunch? Andrew was the only one who agreed. So we had lunch and we became friends. Now, Andrew was very clear that any relationship beyond friendship was not going to happen. Nope. Because we were in the same department. We couldn't risk having a breakup within the same department. Just no. So we went to the zoo as friends. We baked apple pies together as friends. We went cycling amidst the falling leaves along this trail with the sun gleaming on my hair as friends. Well, I had to chase that guy for 2 years before he finally caught me. But catch me he did, and married we were. Which brings us back to Newport, Oregon, where we were celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary. A toast, my love, to the ships not taken.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you, Cynthia. I missed the SAC genre love stories evening, but I just got it.
You did, you did.
Thanks so much. Our next story, going from the personal to the historical. Our next storyteller is Larry Kluger, otherwise known as Lariat Larry, and he is going to tell us a true tale of the American frontier. Take it away, Larry.
Thank you. The night was cold, and Josiah Wilbarger clearly realized the grim reality of his situation. He had no food or water, no clothing. Flies and maggots were at work on his bloody wounds, and there was no way he could make it back to his friend Reuben's home. Josiah realized the shade of the oak tree he lay under would shield him from the relentless Texas sun the next morning. But another day, even another half day in the Texas heat would finish him for sure. As he lay there, his thoughts drifted back 5 years to 1828. When he remembered about 1828 was that he and his family moved 700 miles to Texas from Missouri. There was lots of free land in Texas. They settled along a peaceful river, and their nearest neighbor was 75 miles away. This was such a great opportunity for Josiah's family. Of course, he would miss family and friends back in Missouri, especially his sister Margaret. They were so close as children, almost inseparable. Josiah recalled how once they were trapped on the roof of their home during a flood. Margaret was so scared, but Josiah kept reassuring her, "Have faith and stay calm. Someone will come to save us before too long." And of course they did. As they grew older, they never lost that closeness. They wouldn't go more than a couple of days without seeing each other. It was hardest saying goodbye to Margaret. Those first 4 years in Texas were very lonely for Josiah. He thought of Margaret often, wishing he could visit her and talk to her. After 4 years, in April of 1832, a friend of Josiah's from Missouri, Reuben Hornsby, settled across the river from Josiah with his family. The two families visited each other often, and both their farms prospered. On one of those visits, in August of 1833, Reuben introduced a group of 4 men to Josiah who were interested in settling in Texas. Josiah agreed to show them around the countryside while Reuben remained at home. After several hours, while riding along Walnut Creek, they spotted a lone Indian and they signaled for him to stop. They wanted to talk with him. That Indian, seeing 5 armed white men, fled. They still wanted to talk with him, so they rode after him. But they lost his trail at the headwaters of the creek, and the frustrated men turned back. Looking back on this, Josiah realized the Indian was probably suspicious and scared of the 5 armed white men. He may have even thought they wanted to hurt him. They should have considered that, but they felt their pursuit was innocent and they meant him no harm. When they stopped to rest, they tied up their horses, started preparing their lunch, and forgot all about their previous encounter with the Indians. Meanwhile, that Indian had gathered a number of tribesmen and stalked the white men to their camp. As they ate, the Indians attacked with arrows and gunfire. All 5 men ran for the cover of some nearby trees. First one man, then another went down injured, hit by gunfire. Josiah went to the aid of one, but was hit in the calf by an arrow. He loaded the man's rifle and returned to his own tree for cover. Within seconds, he was hit in the other calf by an arrow. The 2 uninjured men ran for their horses as Josiah fought on. Seeing the 2 men fleeing, Josiah ran after them. A rifle ball struck him in the back of the neck, emerging from the left side of his chin. Frightened and thinking that Josiah had been killed, the 2 uninjured men rode as hard as they could towards the safety of Reuben's home. Excited at their victory, the Indians fell on the injured to finish them off. They cut the throats of Josiah's 2 companions, but not his. Apparently, they thought his neck wound was fatal. They stripped the 3 men of their clothing and scalped him. Then they rode off with their captured horses, leaving their bloody victims behind. Josiah was not dead, though. He was temporarily paralyzed. He was conscious during his terrifying ordeal and fainted shortly after being scalped. When he regained consciousness, it was late afternoon. Josiah knew his only chance for survival was to make it back to Reuben's home 6 miles away. So he started crawling. He crawled 600 yards before collapsing under an oak tree, unable to go 1 inch further. Night fell, dark and cold. And Josiah started thinking about everything that had led up to this lonely end. His wandering thoughts were stopped abruptly when he heard the sound of something or someone. "Brother Josiah," said a soft voice beside him, "you are too weak to go on your own. Remain here and someone will come to save you before midday tomorrow." Josiah's eyes widened in surprise, for there beside him was his sister Margaret, whom he thought was in Missouri. When she was sure he understood what she said, she moved off in the direction of Reuben's home. Meanwhile, the men who escaped made it back to Reuben's home with the tale of the attack. Both of them were certain that Josiah and the other 2 were dead. Reuben decided it was too late to retrieve the bodies. They would head back sometime the next day. That night proved to be troubling for Sarah Hornsby, Reuben's wife. She jumped up from a deep sleep, woke Reuben saying, "I dreamed of Josiah. He was naked, wounded, and scalped. I also saw Margaret, who said he was still alive, but needed our help very badly." "It was just a dream," said Reuben. "Let's go back to sleep." The dream quickly returned, more vivid than before, and Sarah awoke in a cold sweat. "I know Josiah is alive, and I know where he is." Reuben gathered his men and started out before daybreak to find Josiah. They found him exactly where Sarah said he would be, and in the exact condition she had described. They carried him back to Reuben's home, where he was nursed back to health. As soon as he was able, Josiah asked about his sister Margaret. To his surprise, no one had seen her. It was not for some time that the news arrived. Sarah had died in Missouri, 700 miles away, on the same day Josiah was attacked. If not for the love of his sister, who reached beyond the gates of death, Josiah Wilbarger would have died that day in the wilds of Texas.
Wow. Got a little chills up my spine at the end of your story, Larry. Thank you.
It is a true story.
Truth stranger than fiction.
At least as told by the people.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's time to turn our evening back over to our hostess with the mostess, Sally Holtzman. Hi, Sally.
Unmute, Sally.
Well, I want to start by thanking Marnie and Liz again for holding the meeting together, for hosting and doing all the technical work. I'm just sort of like, you know, coming along at the end here, but I appreciate it so much. And I think it's just lovely that we're going to have our festival at the Orinda. And maybe by that time, we will also be active at the Orinda Library. So I feel like I'm sort of out of storytelling. Anyway, it's just a feeling I have. And so I decided I would take a class and see if I could get my chops put back together. And I've been taking this class with Joel Ben Izzy, and it has been such a joy. I just forgot how it was to be spontaneously putting together stories. I forgot it. And I thought of he's doing it using prompts. And I suggest that any of you in the audience, if you have sort of gone dry as far as going to the well and getting stories, think of different prompts or get a book of prompts and try to make up some stories to go with it. And so we've been having these prompts, and one of the prompts was a present. And I was thinking to myself when I wanted to make the story, what kind of present did I ever open in a box and it went, oh, and I was so delighted to see it. Well, I couldn't think of anything. And then I thought about a special present I had gotten a long time ago. In fact, I was almost going to be 60 years old, and I had decided that I would give myself a really big, impressive present. I wanted a present that said 60 years old. In fact, the present I thought of was the same present that I had wanted since I was 10 years old. I went out and I bought myself a horse. Now, when I was 10 years old, my parents had moved from Chicago. When I was 10 years old, my parents sent me away to boarding school from North Carolina to Chicago, the town school for girls. And when I got there, I learned that to be a lady, and their motto was, we make ladies from girls. To be a lady, one had to be an equestrian. One had to know about horses. Well, who knew? And every Saturday, the house mother would take us to Christensen's stables, where I first learned to walk and trot in the small arena, and then to gallop and jump in the big arena, and then finally got to go to the bridle paths of Lincoln Park. And I thought I was something in my brown riding habit with my jockers, my boots, and my derby cap. Well, then my parents moved to Chicago and I went to high school, but I spent all my time still at Christensen's, all my free time. And then when I went to college, I spent every summer as a riding instructor. But finally life intervened, and then there was work, and then there was marriage, and then I had 3 children, and I put all my children in riding camp and they hated it. And then there was a divorce. And years passed and I never rode again. And then it was just a few months before my 60th birthday, and a friend said to me, Sally, I'd like to pick you up with this guy. Let me do that. And so 3 or 4 days later, a man knocked on my door and I opened it, and there was Bob. And he was good looking, and he had beautiful blue eyes, and he had a nice neat shirt on and pressed jeans, and he was wearing cowboy boots. And then parked outside my house was a big Ford 150 pickup truck. And I thought to myself, oh, an urban cowboy. But over dinner, I learned that he had had a ranch and that he had raised horses, and he wore cowboy boots because they were comfortable. And he had a pickup truck because he was a contractor and he needed it to take himself around. Well, coincidentally, at the same time I met Bob, my daughter bought a house that came with a barn and two horses. And she said to me one day, Mother, why don't you, Bob, come on over and ride these horses? now I hadn't ridden for what, 20, 30 years, and we get to the barn, we saddle up the horses. Bob helps me on the saddle and we ride out into Tilden Park. And it was wonderful. It was like I had been riding every day. I mean, it was just, I can't tell you how it filled my heart to be on that horse and riding. And so we rode around to different parks, and then finally we bought a camper, and then we bought a horse trailer. And then we began going, we went to the Sierras. We rode on the beaches of the Pacific Ocean. We went to the desert. We went all over. And finally, Bob said, we have got to buy our own horses. And so we did, just before I turned 60 years old. And we bought Peruvian Pasos. Wonderful, wonderful pacing horses. When they went down the trail, they went pucka, 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 pucka. And they were so smooth that you could put a champagne glass in your hand and the champagne glass wouldn't empty. It would just, they were fabulous horses. And so we continued this great experiment of putting these horses in the trailer and just going wherever we wanted to go. It was a great, great present. I rode until I was 70 years old. Bob rode until he was 90. It was a present of a lifetime. It didn't come in a box and it didn't come in a bow with a bow, but it was the great present of our experience. So that's Bob and me and our lovely little horse story. So we'll see you next month, and get ready for another wonderful, wonderful night. Thanks everybody for coming. We enjoy so much seeing you here. God bless. Keep well. See you next month. Bye-bye.
Wonderful.